Good evening and welcome to Moral Politics. I'm your host, Bill Wolford. A jury just delivered a verdict, guilty. It took 2 trials to convict mentally ill Naveed Haq, the so-called Seattle jihadist. In 2006, Naveed Haq wounded 5 and killed 1 at Seattle's Jewish Federation. What motivated that shooting at the Seattle Jewish Federation? My guest, Richard Silverstein, has covered the Haq Rampage. It was a psychotic tragedy. Conviction may be blind justice for security demanded by the local Jewish community. We explore tonight the role of tribal hatred, Muslim and Jewish alike, in the case of Naveed Haq. Richard Silverstein blogs at Tikkun Olam and Al Jazeera. Was Naveed Haq's conviction on retrial an exercise in justice?
I don't believe so. I believe that Naveed Haq committed a terrible crime. I believe that he should have faced consequences for that crime, that he should have been declared mentally ill. He should have been put into a state mental hospital and received treatment for his illness. But I believe that the guilty verdict, the sentence was pronounced by the judge the other day, of life in prison without the possibility of parole, is not an act of real justice. It's an act that combines justice with vengeance. I think that the Jewish community and the prosecutor felt they needed a pound of flesh.
Was there pressure on the prosecutors to get a conviction?
I think the first trial, which ended in a mistrial, created a huge amount of pressure. The community was deeply, deeply disturbed by...
As they should be. This gentleman went into the Seattle Jewish Federation, gun in hand, and left 1 dead and 5 wounded.
Yes. There had to be a consequence for it. And the community saw the possibility that he would be let off. They didn't know what was going to happen. The prosecutor announced immediately that they would retry. And so I don't believe there was ever any chance that Naveed Haq was going to go free and was going to go back out into the community. But I also don't believe that he should, as a mentally ill, deeply mentally ill individual, be sent to state prison where he will not be treated for his illness.
Well, the first jury must have believed that he was certainly not guilty of the charges that were brought.
The defense was arguing a mental insanity defense, and possibly that resounded a little bit with the jury in the first trial. In the second trial, it didn't have any impact at all. And another thing that deeply disturbs me is that in the first trial, they did not allow a specific telephone call to be used as evidence. In the second trial, they did. It was a conversation between Naveed Haq and his mother in which she tried to walk him through his crime.
Now, this was a jailhouse taped phone call.
Right, right. They taped a conversation between the 2 of them, and she said, Naveed, my son, your illness made you commit this crime. She was hoping that the illness would be a defense that he could use, and he adamantly refused to concede that his illness had anything to do with the act that he did. Of course, you have the irony of someone who even the prosecution concedes is mentally ill, saying that a conversation in which he denied that he was mentally ill and that was part of his crime, how can someone who's mentally ill be able to say whether or not their illness played a part in their crime or not?
Well, that sounds like some legal hair splitting on the part of the prosecutor.
Yeah. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to accept someone who's mentally ill, to accept their definition of not being mentally ill.
Now, the second trial, were the charges upped?
My understanding is that they charged him in the first trial with second-degree murder, and in the second trial with first-degree murder. In this first trial, there were also a huge number of charges. So the prosecution felt they had dissipated the attention and the focus of the jury, and they very much more narrowed down many fewer charges in the second trial. And my understanding from what you've told me is that there's a first-degree charge. And in the first trial, I think the prosecutor wisely said that he could be given the death penalty, and they didn't feel that someone who was mentally ill deserved to receive the death penalty. In this case, that didn't happen, but I still think it was wrong. And I want to say that I think it was wrong not just in its own terms, but I think it was wrong in a Jewish sense, because in our tradition, justice that is not informed with mercy is something that will lead the world to be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And so we have had pure justice in this case.
That's a nice saying, by the way.
Thank you. We've had pure justice, but we haven't had mercy.
Right.
And you know, someone, a hard-headed person seeing this will say, why does a cold-blooded killer deserve mercy? Well, not for the killer's sake, but for our sake as human beings.
Right.
And for my sake as a Jew, I think we need to be sure that what we do is informed with mercy and justice.
But you wrote in one of your blogs that the Jewish community breathed a sigh of relief with the second conviction.
That's right. That's right. There was, I read the headline, you know, after in the Jewish newspaper after the mistrial, and there was consternation in the community. They weren't sure that there would be justice ever. And when this second trial ended with the verdict, this headline again was just a sigh of relief. Everyone's breathed a sigh of relief.
Even though there were 6 victims at the Seattle Jewish Federation building, would you say that the Seattle Jewish community felt identified as a victim?
Oh yes, I think that the community felt like the Middle East conflict was coming home to roost here in Seattle, and that's a nightmare for any Jew anywhere in the world. When they hear the footsteps, you know, the Holocaust, genocide, anti-Semitism, when they hear those footsteps creeping, they go into this kind of atavistic mode of self-preservation, of fear of being, you know, singled out as a Jew, being targeted as a Jew, being killed, or you know, whatever. These things that have terrible things that have happened in our history.
So this is maybe partially explains the organized pressure for the second trial.
Yeah.
That led,
yeah,
we can surmise, to the conviction.
And it explains the deep sensitivity of the prosecutor to the Jewish community in this trial. It was a very sensitive political trial.
Now, each trial had a different prosecutor.
Yes. The first one was a Republican, Norm Malang. The second one was Dan Satterwhite. Norm Malang died after the mistrial in the first trial.
Right. And ironically, Dan Satterberg upped the charges in the second trial, narrowed the focus, and got the conviction.
Right, right. And I think that possibly the fact that he was a new prosecutor made him want to go for some serious charges, more serious than the earlier ones. Norm Malang was a veteran prosecutor who had been in that role for many, many years. I think the fact that he was so experienced made for a much more reasonable set of charges. And I think the fact that Satterwhite was just coming into the job, he needed to prove something, and he needed to get a conviction.
What he needed to prove was that he was not soft on...
exactly.
You know, soft on Muslim hate crime.
Right, not soft on terror. He saw the fact that you have a crime here that many people conceive of as being based on terror, based on anti-Semitism. He wanted to be tough on that. It falls into this whole national war on terror kind of mode that was, you know, prominent in 2006 and after the 9/11 attack.
I noticed that the U.S. attorney at the time also chimed in and was alleging federal hate crimes, possibly.
Right, right. And that, again, this is John McKay, who was one of the prosecutors who ended up being fired by Karl Rove, but I'm sure as part of his job he knew that it was his job to get convictions for terror-related crimes, and that this nicely fit into that kind of rubric.
Now, was Naveed Haq even a Muslim?
Naveed Haq, we should talk a little bit about his background probably. He's a Pakistani-American raised in Eastern Washington. His father is an engineer at Hanford, very upstanding member of the Muslim community, founded a mosque in Richland, I believe. But Naveed Haq appears to have been a loner, someone who was a kind of a loser, who couldn't fit in anywhere, a depressed kind of person. Also somebody who had been treated for mental illness for 10 years and who was under medication for this psychotic condition that he had.
And still he was convicted of first-degree murder without the possibility of parole.
And the prosecution acknowledged his mental illness. However, they refused to accept a plea that would mean him pleading guilty by reason of insanity, which is what the defense wanted, which is what I think should have been the actual outcome had there been justice and mercy here.
Would you even want to venture motive on Naveed Haq's part?
Well, you know, I would feel more comfortable talking about other acts of terrorism, like the one that happened in Detroit or in Fort Hood, or because there you have people who are more mentally stable, and you can understand at least from their point of view why they engaged in their act. Clearly, Naveed Haq, in some sense, was motivated by the killings that Israel had engineered in Lebanon during the 2006 Lebanon War, in which Israel was attempting to destroy Hezbollah and ended up killing.
So at the time of the shooting, the Lebanon 2000 war the pounding was still going on.
Yes. Well, I don't think the war was still going on. It might have been after the war ended. But as we've just been talking about, Bill, everybody who had any awareness of the Lebanon war had seen pictures of children killed by bombing, had seen pictures of bodies in rubble, had seen pictures of ambulances shot up by the IDF. So even I, as a Jew, was deeply affected by those pictures. You were affected, and you're a Christian, and certainly we have to think about how Muslims would be affected by this. If I were to see pictures of Jews killed in the way that the Lebanese were killed, I would, God only knows what I would do. Ehud Barak, who's now the defense minister, made a very famous statement, and he said that if I was a Muslim or I was a Palestinian, I would be a Palestinian militant. And this is a guy who's a former chief of staff of the Israeli IDF and now the current defense minister. So if we can say as Jews or as Israelis that we would be defending our own with violence if necessary, we have to understand that Muslims might have the same reaction. That does not mean that any of us should justify the killings that Naveed Haq engaged in, or the terrorism that happened at Fort Hood or in Detroit. But it means that we have to understand that if Israel is going to be perpetually at war with its neighbors and going to be perpetually killing Muslims or killing Arabs, that there is going to be blowback from that. We have to understand that, and it means that we have to solve this conflict before it gets worse.
In a way, what you're getting at is, war and killing, and I think what isn't said, but a lot of people might have observed, is that it wasn't just war that was taking place in Lebanon 2006.
Right. It wasn't a war between two equal military forces. It was a war between Israel with a very sophisticated world-class military and Hezbollah, which is an insurgent guerrilla force, which, by the way, that insurgent guerrilla force seemed to hold Israel to a standstill. And in addition to that, it was a war, and the Israeli military itself said this is not just a war with the Lebanese military or the Hezbollah. This is a war against the Lebanese people. And that is what, in my opinion, would turn it into a war crime, because Israel does not have the right to go to war against a civilian population, which is what they did in Lebanon and which is what they did in Gaza.
But there's so many people that are actually throwing gasoline on this fire of hate.
Yes.
And you cited one on your blog, and I thought, I've never heard of her really, Geller.
Pam Geller, right.
You call her the blog world's premier Jewish hate monger.
Yes, there are a number of people like that who have an impact among their readers and in the broader Jewish community. There's Daniel Pipes, who is...
Everybody's heard of him, and he's just really off to an extreme.
Yeah, he's the one who tries to say that all Muslims... Well, Pam Geller says that Islam as a religion is insane. So for her, Naveed Haq, being a Muslim, was insane, let alone his own personal mental condition.
Now, does she have a following? Do people...
Yes, yes. I think that she was part originally of a group of bloggers that formed something called Pajamas Media, which was a sort of Jewish neocon set of bloggers that banded together, and the Pajamas Media still exists in a reduced format. And Daniel Pipes runs a website called Campus Watch, and he actually keeps tabs on specific professors through their students, and they report on the professors if they say something that is quote-unquote anti-Jewish or anti-Israel, and he keeps tabs on that, and he promotes on the web specific individuals, Jewish professors and non-Jewish professors, and labels them as pro-terrorists or anti-Semitic or anti-Israel.
And yet, you know, this isn't all that well known, and there's no outcry, yet the person who started the website Jew Watch, which really is not a very positive place. It's not a very positive website. Its intent is not nice, but it's no worse than what Dan Pipes is doing.
Yeah, I think that unfortunately Jews and neocons take Pam Geller and Daniel Pipes and a whole host of other blogs that we could name quite seriously, and that's the way in which their ideas creep more into the mainstream. Just as an example, if you look at the New York Times, their coverage of Israel includes a website that's called Memory. And Memory is an anti-Arab website that translates Arab media into English to present Islam and the Arab people in the worst possible light. And this gets into the New York Times. And in the same sense, when Pam Geller, Daniel Pipes, and all these people get their ideas accepted in the mainstream of the Jewish community, this is extremely dangerous because it means that anti-Muslim sentiment creeps into the discourse of the mainstream Jewish community. And from there, non-Jews say, well, if the Jewish community thinks that Islam is insane, then I've got to treat this as a serious idea. Mm-hmm. And that's very disturbing. And it leads to the Jewish Naveed Haqs, the Jewish Al-Qaeda types, this know-nothing kind of crazy anti-Muslim sentiment that can lead an American Jew like Jack Titel in Israel, who is now...
A really infamous character. I can't believe that types like that exist.
Yeah, there's unfortunately a lot of American Jews who go to Israel and act out their hostility towards Muslims through settlements, and Jack Titel is accused of murdering 2 Israeli policemen. He's accused of planting a bomb that wounded a Christian. He's accused of planting a bomb that wounded a distinguished professor at the Hebrew University who was opposed to the settlers. So this is what happens when the ideas of Daniel Pipes or Pam Geller get accepted too much in the mainstream.
Hate gets ratcheted up. Is there any way to ratchet it down?
We need to show as Jews that we are opposed to the worst excesses of Israel in order for us to have credibility with the Arab community and with the Muslim community.
And yet Geller and Pipes enjoy place within the Jewish community. They're not ostracized.
There are other people in leadership roles in the Jewish community who share their views. So you have a group called the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations that's run by someone named Malcolm Hoenlein, who is a neocon, who believes that we need regime change in Iran. You have somebody like Abe Foxman running the ADL, Anti-Defamation League. You have a group called the Zionist Organization of America. These are the Israel lobby, and these are people truly in a leadership role. And their views are, to a degree, informed by the more radical right-wing people like Geller and Pipes that we've been talking about.
These are the fundamentalist Jews of America that are leading to extremism, that are, in a way, maybe precipitating the Naveed Haq Rampage.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're precipitating it, but I would say that they react to Palestinian violence against Israelis in such an extreme way that it ratchets up the whole level of hostility between both groups. Mm-hmm. And that is what leads to the Naveed Haqs of the world. Whether
this
it's in
blowback where you forget who struck before and you only look at the latest strike and take it from there.
There is this tendency among Pipes and Geller and Mort Klein at the ZOA and Abe Foxman to think that Israel and Jews have never done anything wrong. And if they did ever do anything wrong, it was so minuscule and compared to the heinousness of the crimes committed against Israel by Palestinians or by Arabs or by Muslims. There's this inability to understand how our actions, or Israeli actions, impacted Muslims.
When you wrote one of your blogs, you called for an absolute urgency for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. You were a little tentative when writing that because it seemed to insinuate that people that are reading your blog, people in the Jewish community, may not accept that advice.
I always see myself as not a lone voice, but maybe as a minority voice in the community on these issues. I see myself as kind of, the canary in the coal mine, or the role of the biblical prophets, although I wouldn't liken myself to one. But I think that I am a person who is putting forth a principled view about these kinds of issues that needs to be heard. In Israel, there is a peace movement on the left that oppose the war in Lebanon and oppose the war in Gaza. And there's a group of human rights NGOs in Israel that are doing very, very important work. And those people need to be listened to. If we ignore those people, if we stifle those people, if we vilify those people, as I have been by some of my readers and my commenters and my email traffic, we run the risk of not having those voices for sanity in our community. Because Israel's actions in Lebanon and Gaza, I believe, were horrific, were subhuman, the Goldstone report, if you look at it, I think has a lot of very important material that needs to be examined about what Israel did in Gaza. Mm-hmm. We need to hold fast to higher standards than Israel did in Gaza and in Lebanon. That is not to say that Israel does not face legitimate threats and does not have the right to defend itself when it faces those threats. Mm-hmm. But it needs to deal with the hostility against it and the lack of recognition by certain parties in the Middle East through peaceful negotiation and not through war.
Or otherwise we'll have Geller and Pipes speaking to the crowd, and God knows what will happen then.
Right, exactly. There's an image I recall on Pam Geller's blog of the way to deal with the Arabs in East Jerusalem, and she has a picture of B-52 bomber. And that's her way of dealing with the Arab problem, is a B-52 bomber, and she praises the cartoonist who did that. And
there has to be a price to pay for that type of inhumanity and derangement. We need to point our fingers at that person and say, don't join us in polite society here. You're not fit.
Right. The people like Pipes and Geller should be ostracized from the normal mainstream Jewish community, and instead they receive invitations to speak at synagogues. Rabbis honor them. They speak at Pipes has spoken at Brandeis University, a Jewish university in the East Coast. This is terrible that this happens. We should not allow these people to be seen as mainstream.
And they are an American Jewry. This is happening.
They are. They're too much seen as mainstream in the community. Not everybody in the community listens to them. There are many people in the community who understand the danger of their views, but not enough. And especially the leadership, which has the reins of controls the discourse in the community, controls who's invited to speak and where they can speak. These people should not be given platforms in the community. They should not be invited to speak at our synagogues, and they should not be invited to hold forth and spew their message of hate against Muslims.
You know, it's really tragic that a psychotic episode, a rampage at the Seattle Jewish Federation, was required to have a kind of deep dialogue about this issue, about the fact that there is hate and stewing in both sides, the Muslim side and the Israeli side, the Jewish side, and it has to end, because look where it has taken us. Where can it go?
I want to say that I don't believe that enough of a lesson has been learned in our community here in Seattle as a result of this rampage. There have been some acts of mosques and synagogues getting together to talk with each other, but it's on a very superficial level as far as I can tell. There aren't dialogues, very many at least, happening on a serious level where people on both sides are talking about what really divides them, talking about political issues, talking about religious hatred, and talking about those kinds of issues. I've tried and not succeeded in doing that myself.
Even with rabbis, you're unsuccessful.
I've been unsuccessful in my own synagogue, I have to say, in getting my rabbi to agree to have a twinning program with a mosque on the east side. And it's not just my synagogue or my rabbi. There are some of these things happening, but as I said, when they do happen, the rabbi and his community is usually too frightened of dealing with the really dangerous and difficult issues. So they deal with the superficialities that people can talk about no matter who they are. And they don't deal with the hatred, and they don't deal with the violence and the war and all the political issues that you really have to deal with if you're a serious person. And that is what, when you said what you just said, I wish that it were true. I wish there was a lesson that had been learned. I wish the Jewish Federation would engage in some kind of really systematic program of dialogue with the local Muslim community, and it's not happening.
And put pressure on Israel to mend its ways when it needs to mend its ways, so that every rampage and every city doesn't become symbolic of the mutual hate. If you had to sum up for our viewers, what would you say the Naveed Haq Rampage in 2006 at the Seattle Jewish Federation represents?
I would say it represents a kind of toxic relationship between Jews and Muslims, and between Israelis and Arabs in the Middle East. And it fed in the mind of this deeply troubled person, and was expressed in such a way as it led to this terrible act of violence. But I think that what it shows is that we as American Jews need to do whatever we can to put pressure on the American government and on the Israelis to come to terms with the Arabs and come to a peace agreement. It means that we need to pressure Barack Obama to hang tough in these negotiations, to be tough with the Israelis and with the Palestinians, and not let either side get out of making the compromises that they need to make. If we don't do that, we will have more violence of this type.
And Richard, I want to applaud you and invite you back, really, to come in and have these dialogues. Thank you very much for being a guest again on Moral Politics.
Thank you, Bill, for the platform. I appreciate it.